Thank you, Maliha, and I want to thank Engin for extending the invitation, and to Lisa and Radha for an amazing job at coordinating all the logistics, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm multiply hooked up, so forgive me if one of the speakers drops down or perks up, we'll manage. The right to religious freedom is widely regarded as a crowning achievement of secular liberal democracies, one that guarantees the peaceful coexistence of religiously diverse populations. Enshrined in national constitutions and international laws and treaties, the right to religious liberty promises to ensure two stable goods. One, the ability to choose one's religion freely without coercion by the state, church, or other institutions. And two, the creation of a polity in which one's economic, civil, legal, or political status is unaffected by one's religious beliefs. While all members of a polity are supposed to be protected by this right, modern wisdom has it that religious minorities are its greatest beneficiaries, and their ability to practice their traditions without fear of discrimination is a key marker of a tolerant and civilized polity. While it is common to conceive of religious liberty as an individual human right, a far less recognized aspect of religious liberty is its long-standing use as a technology of modern governance and its role in the maintenance of a geopolitical and international legal order. In so much as the inequality between Western and non-Western sovereignty is a structural feature of the modern geopolitical order, at least since the 18th century, the establishment of the principle of religious liberty, as well as its ongoing exercise in non-Western countries, continues to be shaped by this inequality. My talk today is an exploration of this neglected dimension of the right to religious liberty. Focusing on the Middle East, I analyze how the discourse on religious freedom from its inception has been intertwined with the exercise of Western Christian and secular power, and how its subsequent institutionalization through national and international laws continues to be beholden to this history. A key figure in this alternative genealogy of the right to religious liberty is the figure of the minority that has served as a site for its articulation and justification for the exercise of European power over non-European lands and sovereignties. As I will show, from the 16th century onwards, the discourse on religious liberty in the Middle East has been entwined with European projects of extending protections to non-Muslim minorities, primarily Christian, as a means of securing European interests in the region. The recent adoption of the International Religious Freedom Act by the US Congress in 1998, which authorizes the US president to persecute violations of religious liberty globally, particularly of Christian minorities, is only the most recent example in this long-standing pattern. As I will show, such a historical project cannot simply be understood as an instrumentalization of religious minorities for geopolitical ends. Instead, one must ask as to how the very concept of religious minority, its space of problematization, is indebted to this history. Viewed from this perspective, religious minorities do not simply signify a demographic entity that are accorded a space of freedom and immunity by the institutionalization of religious liberty, as is often thought, but are also produced through the process of the legal codification of this principle. One of the key questions that guides my talk today is how the discourse on religious liberty has participated in the production of the minority problem in international law, and how this problem has unfolded in the history of the modern Middle East. It is clear that any discussion of the persecution of religious minorities in our world today is a vexed enterprise. Difficult questions are at stake in such an undertaking. On the one hand, there is no doubt that violent and discriminatory attacks against religious and ethnic minorities are widespread in the world today. Whether it is the organized pogroms against the Muslim minority in India and earlier in Bosnia, or the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran and Christians in Egypt and Nigeria and Egypt, It is clear that in the last several decades, religious and ethnic minorities have come under brutal and sometimes genocidal attacks in a manner that seemed inconceivable at the end of the Second World War. On the other hand, one cannot treat the fact of religious persecution of minorities as simply a sign of the increased intolerance of contemporary societies, or a characteristic of certain religions and cultures. Rather, one must think critically about conditions of secular liberal governance, both national and international, that define what counts as an act of religious persecution. In pondering interreligious strife today, I want to suggest the relevant question is not so much what inhibits the realization of religious freedom, as if religious freedom were an ahistorical and universally valid good, but how the national and international regulation and protection of religious minorities makes specific notions of freedom and unfreedom possible and imaginable. What is the political and legal history of the emergence of the concept of religious freedom? What are the conditions of geopolitical power that have allowed for its globalization? How has this universally recognized liberal right come to affect the religious minority and majority populations of the modern state differently? In European historiography, the signing of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 is often narrated as a foundational moment in the emergence of the twin concepts of religious liberty and state sovereignty that not only brought an end to almost 100 years of religious warfare among Christians, but also paved the way for the eventual creation of a political order in which religious tolerance became an integral part of modern governance and statecraft. While some scholars view the Peace of Westphalia as an earlier moment in Europe's unfolding commitment to the virtue of tolerance, others see it as a far more pragmatic instrument that helped settle long-standing territorial disputes, granting formal independence to polities struggling to be free from the Holy Roman Empire, such as the Netherlands, Switzerland, Savoy, and Milan. In this latter understanding, the Peace of Westphalia is credited with establishing the principle, if not the practice, of state sovereignty, with the sovereign's right to control his territory and subjects free from outside intervention. What I want to highlight here is that in European historiography, the symbolic birth of the concept of religious liberty is deeply intertwined with the establishment of the principle of state sovereignty, territorial exchange between warring parties, and the creation of an interstate protocol for handling what used to be called religious dissidents, but later came to be regarded as religious minorities. While the fundamental relationship between religious liberty and the doctrine of modern sovereignty in European history is widely acknowledged, far less appreciated are the exceptions this narrative enacted as the discourse of religious liberty traveled to non-European shores. Notably, the introduction of the principle and practice of religious freedom to non-Western lands was often predicated upon the violation and subjugation of the principle of state sovereignty instead of its consolidation, as enshrined, of course, in the Treaties of Westphalia. Consider, for example, the repeated attempts by Christian European rulers to assert their right to protect Christian minorities within the Ottoman Empire throughout the 16th century. As long as the empire was strong, it was able to accommodate these pressures without compromising its sovereignty. But once Ottoman power started to decline, it was unable to resist Western European incursions on behalf of the Ottoman Christian population. As early as 16th century, Ottoman rulers had granted special privileges known as capitulations to Western European traders that ensured a considerable degree of self-government in matters of criminal and civil jurisdiction, as well as freedom of religion and worship. Historians note that these privileges soon came to apply also to European missionaries and eventually indigenous Ottoman Christian communities, what were then called Eastern Christians. This de facto amounted to the revocation of Ottoman law in relation to Ottoman subjects. Notably, no parallel privileges existed for non-Christians residing in territories ruled by Christian empires at this time. Now, the Treaties of Paris and Berlin 1856 and 1878 respectively, both signed when Ottoman power was in decline, also contained provisions for religious liberty that the Ottomans and the newly independent republics were made to adopt under European pressure. For example, the Treaty of Berlin, following the Russo-Turkish War, made the extension of religious liberty to minority subjects a condition for extending recognition to Romania, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Serbia, all of which were breakaway states from the Ottoman Empire. In the wake of these treaties, as the Ottomans undertook broad reforms known as the Tanzimat, they passed the sweeping decree of Hatt-i Humayun in 1856 that ostensibly guaranteed freedom of religion to all its subjects, dismantling distinctions based on religion, language, and race, and forms of legal hierarchy between Muslims and non-Muslims. While this was the letter of the decree, historians point out that in practice, formal and informal discrimination against non-Muslims continued unchecked. What I want to emphasize here is the extent to which the discourse on religious liberty in Ottoman territories at the end of the 19th century was linked to geopolitics and questions of sovereignty and territorial control. Religious liberty was, however, far from a stable signifier and meant different things to different actors, which were often shaped by inter- and intra-state dynamics. For the missionaries, increasingly active in the Ottoman territories by the 19th century, and the European partisans, religious liberty meant the freedom to proselytize in the Ottoman territories, and an important means for securing religious conversion. The Ottomans, on the other hand, interpreted religious liberty as the freedom to defend their religion against ascendant missionary activity and to consolidate the Islamic character of the empire. For many, though by no means all Ottoman Christians, who continued to face discrimination by the Ottoman state, religious liberty became one of the primary idioms through which to claim Western protection against systemic discrimination and at times outright violence, as was the case with the Armenian Christians. For all stakeholders, though, the struggle over the meaning and implementation of religious liberty could not but engage questions of geopolitical struggle and sovereignty, regardless of where they stood on the issue. Now, the Versailles Peace Conference in the year 1919 is often narrated as a transformative moment in world history that not simply ended the First World War, but also heralded the creation of a new international order based on the nation state, with the decisive dissolution of the system of empires, the Ottoman, the Habsburgs, and the Hohenzollern empires that had lost the war. While the institutional form of the nation-state was already prevalent in countries of Western Europe and North America, it was now extended by the victorious powers to the breakaway states created from the fallen empires. Notably, despite the novel character of this new international order, the Versailles peace treaties repeated the old pattern of European powers stipulating minority rights over states they militarily defeated. The Allied powers made their recognition of the newly independent states conditional upon the pledge to uphold the rights of religious and ethnic minorities within their boundaries. Notably, none of the Western European countries, Britain, the United States, Italy, France, Belgium, and Denmark, accepted any minority provisions for their own populations. Welsh and Irish in Britain, Native Americans and Blacks in the US, and the Bretons and Basques in France, and the multinational Tyrol in Italy. In fact, Germany that lost the war was not subject to these conditions, an exemption whose irony was not lost on the states forced to accept minority stipulations in 1919 once the Nationalist Socialist project unfolded in Germany. And of course, it was the culturalist logic that made Germany exempt from these provisions. Following the Second World War, the establishment of the nation-state as the dominant political form put into play a new rationale of governance that divided up the governed differently from the logic of empires. Instead of recognizing parallel and contiguous communities distinct by virtue of their confessional, denominational, or tribal and ethnic affiliations, the nation-state sought to represent the people, united by a shared history, culture, and territory, wherein each individual qua citizen was tied to the state through a legal system of rights and obligations. The terms majority and minority came to serve as a constitutional device for resolving differences that the ideology of nationalism sought to eradicate, eliminate, or assimilate. The concept of national minority is built, however, on a fundamental tension. On the one hand, it signifies the membership of a minority group in a national polity. On the other hand, the minority group, by virtue of its cultural, racial, religious, ethnic, or linguistic difference from the majoritarian culture, also represents an incipient threat to national unity. So in other words, this is internal to the logic of the nation state. This threat is internal to the ideology of nationalism in so much as the modern concept of nationhood regards linguistic, ethnic, and cultural characteristics as a legitimate basis for people's claim to national self-determination and independent statehood. The minority treaties under the auspices of the League of Nations and the International Court of Justice during the interwar years were instituted precisely to regulate this dual character of national minorities. They were to monitor minority rights infractions committed by the newly created nation states on the one hand, and regulate the threat irredentist movements posed through the status quo of the system of nation states created by Allied powers. As is well known by now, the minority rights regulatory system put into place in the interwar period to police irredentist movements and violations of minority treaty terms collapsed with the onset of the Second World War. Not only was Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia opportunistically premised on the ostensible protection of the German minority living in Sudetenland, the League of Nations failed in its mandate to curtail the rise of anti-Semitism and protect European minorities from genocide. An important factor in the discreditation of the language of minority rights was the emergence of the United States as the dominant power, whose national ideology ennobled the individual as the basis for all political values, eschewing any notion of community, collectivity, or group rights. Ironically, even as the American architects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights championed individual equality as the basis of universal human rights, they refused to grant civil or political rights to African Americans who continued to suffer under the US apartheid regime of racial inequality. When the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, tried to use the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to make its case for racial equality in the United Nations, they were rebuffed by Eleanor Roosevelt herself, who was the architect, as you know, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, who went on record to declare the minority question does not exist on the American continent. As a result, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, religious liberty came to be enshrined as an individual human right, in which the term community is mentioned in relation to the individual's right to practice his religion collectively. No mention is made of group or minority rights in regard to the exercise of religious liberty. The discourse on the protection of religious and ethnic minorities fell out of favor for almost 5 decades until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1989, when it emerges once again with the creation of new republics and the displacement of peoples across state boundaries in a manner not seen since the end of the Second World War. It is in this context that the United Nations General Assembly in 1992 passed the Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National or Ethnic, Religious, and Linguistic Minorities, and the legally binding Article 27 of International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, in which the rights of minorities are the primary concern. Article 27 not only affirms the right of minorities to be protected against discrimination, but also to be able to practice their distinct collective identity and to participate in local decision-making procedures that affect them, provided it is compatible with national legislation. As before, these minority rights were guaranteed by the successor states of Yugoslavia in return for European and American recognition in terms strongly reminiscent of the Treaties of Paris and Berlin. This history of the interrelationship between religious liberty, minority rights, and geopolitics is often read as the cynical instrumentalization of otherwise noble principles in the service of realpolitik, or as the distribution of a moral good that Western Europeans discovered for themselves that they slowly introduced to less enlightened cultures, sometimes through imperial force and sometimes through soft means such as international diplomacy. Seen in this way, the principle itself, its logic, its aim, and its substantive meaning remains unsullied by the impious intentions of the empires and states that either sought to promote or subvert it. Such an argument needs to be complicated for several reasons. First, it is important to understand that European efforts to subject weaker states to accept provisions for religious freedom for minorities since the 16th century cannot be understood simply as an extension of a culture of tolerance to non-Western peoples and lands. If this were so, the European powers would have accepted similar provisions in regard to their own minorities, which they refused to do throughout history. As I've shown, far from being a measure of a culture's intolerance towards its others, religious freedom has been tied from its inception to the exercise of sovereign power, regional and national security, and the inequality of geopolitical power relations. Given this fundamental co-constitution, religious liberty is not simply a stable principle of secular liberal governance, but has been constituted by the exercise of geopolitical power and the varying strategies of global governance employed by the Euro-Atlantic states. Second, it would be wrong to assume that religious liberty consists of simply protecting certain groups or individuals from the exercise of state power. That is, drawing the separation between church and state firmly and resolutely. The people who are supposed to benefit most from the modern principle of religious liberty, namely religious minorities, are not simply protected from abuses of state power, but are also transformed by virtue of their subjection to the calculus of state and geopolitical power in unique and unpredictable ways. The shift, for example, from a group-based understanding of religious liberty to an individualist one in international legal discourse is not simply a conceptual shift, but also transforms the substantive meaning of religious liberty as well as the kinds of subjects that can speak in its name. Furthermore, as shifting definitions of religious liberty prescribed by international legal discourse came to be adopted by nation-states, they often conflicted and overlapped with existing protocols and norms of minority-majority relations across lines of religious difference in the Middle East. In this hybrid context, claims to religious liberty made by members of a minority versus a majority often mobilized different understandings of religious liberty, ethically, procedurally, and substantively. In the next half of my talk tonight, I want to think about these different mobilizations through the case of Christian-Muslim relations in Egypt. The Coptic Orthodox community constitutes between 6 to 12% of the Egyptian population. Under the Ottoman millet system, Coptic Christians were regarded as Ahl al-Dhimma, a term whose juridical implications included the obligation to the state to protect the so-called people of the book, Jews and Christians, including the individual's life, property, and freedom of religion and worship. There are two key aspects of this older arrangement that stand in contrast to how religious freedom is imagined today. One, unlike the modern conception of freedom of conscience based on the individual, the freedom accorded to the dhimmis to protect their religions was conceived in collective terms. This meant that each dhimmi community, which literally means the protected community, living under Muslim rule, was free to manage its own religious affairs, including matters relating to family law, inheritance, and divorce, which were regarded as an inextricable part of religion. Two, the collective freedom to practice one's religion in this earlier period did not presume the liberal individualist notion of equality that makes the modern conception of freedom of conscience possible. Instead, it was predicated upon a system of protections and obligations in which all legal subjects were first and foremost members of a religious community, and each community stood in a hierarchical relationship to the ruling Muslim Ummah. Over the course of the 19th century in Egypt, many of the restrictions imposed on Copts were lifted, including the payment of the special tax, the donning of sartorial markers, exclusion from military service, and strict constraints on the construction and restoration of the churches. Coptic Orthodox Christians are distinct from other Christian communities of the Middle East, in that they are known to have shunned offers of European patronage starting from the Ottoman period until well into the first half of the 20th century. One of the key reasons for Coptic resistance to repeated European overtures is a long-standing schism since the 5th century that divided Orthodox Oriental Christians from the rest of Christendom. Coptic Orthodox Christians are considered to be part of Oriental Orthodox Christianity. Following this schism, Coptic followers were subject first to brutal repression by the Byzantine emperors and later to aggressive proselytization campaigns undertaken by the Roman Catholic Church, all of which further entrenched the tensions and divisions between the Coptic Church and Western as well as Eastern Orthodox Christianity. During the course of modern history, Western Christendom has continued to view the Copts as backward and ignorant people, a view upheld not only by European missionaries but also important Orientalists like Edward Lane and colonial administrators such as Lord Cromer. During the 19th century, Coptic relations with Western Christendom went through a series of new tensions with fresh incursions of Protestant missions, initially sent from Europe, Anglican, Episcopalian, and Lutheran, and later the United States, Presbyterians. Since none of these had success with Muslim converts, they concentrated their energies on the Copts competing with the Coptic Orthodox Church for their flock. The discourse of religious liberty was crucial to the missionaries as an instrument to proselytize freely among Muslims and Copts, without constraint from existing laws and prohibitions against religious conversion. They made ubiquitous use of international diplomacy and colonial and foreign offices of Anglo-American governments in this cause. Notably, the principle of religious liberty, far from being a secular instrument of state neutrality, was for these advocates closely woven with their desire to win Christian converts. With the spread of nationalist ideas and the promise of civil and political equality under the aegis of the modern nation-state, Muslim-Christian relations in Egypt reached a new crossroad. The early part of the 20th century is a high moment in the history of modern Egypt, when Copts and Muslims united against British colonial rule. While the year 1919 is known in the history of international law for the institutionalization of the term national minority, it is best known in Egypt for the Coptic refusal to accept this term as a form of self-identification. Egyptian national historiography proudly recounts the revolution of 1919 when Copts and Muslims mounted a heroic opposition against the British, demanding an end to colonial rule. When the British offered special protections to the Copts as a minority, they rejected this offer on the basis that they were no different than Muslim Egyptians. Subsequently, when Egypt's first constitution was drafted in 1923, Coptic leadership opposed the idea of proportionate minority representation. What was perhaps even more striking was that none of the Coptic members of the Constitutional Committee objected to the provision in the Constitution that Islam was to be the religion of the state. Famously, Makram Ebeid, a prominent Coptic member of the leading Egyptian party, is known to have stated that he was a Muslim by country and a Christian by religion. This narrative of national unity, however, came to be increasingly strained as the century progressed. And by the time of the establishment of the Egyptian Republic in 1952, it was showing marked signs of stress. Under the charismatic leadership of the first president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the new republic failed to deliver on the democratic promise of the earlier revolution and created instead an authoritarian regime that eroded civil and political liberties for all Egyptians, including Copts. Nasser's authoritarian and despotic tendencies led him to break up the autonomy and power of secular lay Copts, instead strengthening the authority of the centralized church that Nasser could more easily manipulate. One consequence of enshrining the church as the sole representative of Copts in Egypt was that religious affiliation became the Copts' main marker, not their citizenship. After Nasser's death in 1970, many of the strengths he institutionalized have been reinforced under the two subsequent regimes, with the result that the diacritics of religious difference have become indelibly lodged within the problematic of citizenship. Importantly, since 1952, Egyptian civil and political life has been confessionalized to such an extent that it is impossible for most Egyptians to think about what it means to be a citizen outside the context of their religious affiliation. One of the most disturbing consequences of this polarization of religious identity in Egypt is the gradual increase in sectarian violence over the last 10 years. The fact that perpetrators of violence go unprosecuted and the victims are denied adequate state protection further reinforces the impression that the state agencies are deeply implicated. It is widely acknowledged that some of the attacks have been actually perpetrated by the state internal security forces who act with impunity under the cover of emergency laws that continue to be in effect in Egypt since 1981. Copts, by the way, are not the only religious minority group that have come under attack in recent years. The Baha'is, who comprise no more than 1% of the population, and the small Muslim Shia minority have been targeted by the state security police as well. It is within this double-edged context of the confessionalization of Egyptian civic public life and the increase in interreligious violence that many Copts have come to question their community's earlier rejection of the term minority as a form of self-identity. For these Coptic thinkers and activists, the only way to secure government recognition of and response to Coptic grievances is to adopt the international language of minority rights, particularly their right to religious liberty. Mahdi Khalil is a prominent Coptic activist who argues for aggressive foreign intervention on behalf of Copts, including the use of international law and US government action. Of course, as you all know, US is the second largest recipient of US aid after Israel. He strongly endorses the use of the term religious minority for Copts, which he argues not only objectively describes their demographic status, but lays bare a history of religious discrimination that can only be redressed through recourse to international laws that are ultimately supra-sovereign over the Egyptian state itself. Khalil regards the Coptic rejection of the assignation minority as the result of the hatred and pressure from the majority. In contrast to Khalil, there are other Coptic thinkers, such as Samir Morqas, a prominent Coptic figure in Egyptian intellectual and public life who has a long history of nationalist activism. In a series of books and articles, Morqas has challenged the linkage Coptic and Muslim activists alike tend to draw between the realization of political equality for Copts and their designation as a minority. Specifically addressing activists like Mahdi Khalil, he argues, and I quote, "They believe that they are bringing Egyptian consciousness to a new level that is not encompassed by the framework of national community. In this, they want to present Muslims and Copts as a majority versus a minority rather than citizens of the Egyptian nation. There is a fundamental contradiction between the two. The concept of minority emanates from a divisive and fractious principle, whereas citizenship emanates from the principle of equality in rights and responsibilities, and participation in the creation and adoption of decisions at all levels, for all citizens, irrespective of differences in occupation, class, language, ethnicity, or relation. Whereas the thought of majority and minority does not help achieve this equality." End of quote. These two positions, exemplified by Khalil and Morqas, define the parameters of public debate about minority rights in Egypt today. It would be a mistake to understand these two positions as peculiar to Egyptian history. Rather, they exemplify the structural tensions internal to the conceptual and institutional artifice of minority rights, particularly the inequality between first and third world sovereignty that continues to inform the discourse of minority rights. As I've shown, the discourse of minority rights in the Middle East is historically intertwined with conditions of geopolitical inequality, an inequality that has been perpetuated earlier in the 20th century, both by colonial ruler and later by supranational political forms. Given this historical imbrication, arguments such as Mahdi Khalil's that call on Western powers and international institutions to intervene on behalf of Copts cannot be understood as colonial in any simple sense, in so much as these arguments presuppose and reflect the historical reality of minority rights in the Middle East. Khalil implicitly recognizes this history and the institutional conditions necessary for securing minority rights, particularly for Christian minorities in Egypt. For Copts such as Murqus, the history of geopolitical inequality between the Middle East and Western power is equally relevant and serves as a starting point for any reflection on the status of Copts in Egypt. Unlike Khalil, however, Murqus concludes that in so much as the principle of minority rights was the vehicle for the subjugation of national sovereignty to foreign rule, it cannot serve as the instrument for Coptic salvation. Any embrace of this principle necessarily entails the inscription of Copts in this long-standing colonialist project. While we may be tempted to side with one position over the other, it is impossible to deny the imbrication of both and the paradox that haunts the discourse of minority rights globally as well as in the Middle East. While minority rights discourse could have taken a number of different forms in Egypt, it is religious freedom that has emerged as its primary site of articulation and struggle. In contrast to the 80s and 90s, current Egyptian public's debate is saturated with the vocabulary unheard of before. Hurriyat al-Aqida, Hurriyat al-Mu'taqid, Isdira al-Adyan, Hurriyat al-Aqaliyat, Fitna Taifiyya, all of which refer to the idea of religious liberty and religious sectarianism. Civil society organizations that used to avoid taking on religious issues now regularly mount legal challenges in defense of religious freedom using the language enshrined in the Egyptian constitution and international human rights conventions such as Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 27 of the ICCPR. When asked, informed Egyptians cite a number of interrelated developments that have contributed to the popularization of the concept of religious liberty. Key among them, the passage of International Religious Freedom Act by the US government in 1998 that has made the treatment of non-Muslim minorities in the Middle East a central point of concern. It authorizes the President of the United States to censure, through diplomatic and economic means, states that are found to be guilty. The act also established the Office of International Religious Freedom within the US State Department, to which an ambassador at large is appointed, and a special advisor now serves on the National Security Council. While Section 402 of this act requires the President to subject states identified as severe violators of religious freedom to a series of punitive sanctions, it also provides for a presidential waiver that allows for exceptions when the violators are valuable trading partners or geopolitical allies of the US government. Consequently, states such as Saudi Arabia, Israel, and China are often omitted from the current list, whereas others such as Iran and Sudan retain their place as states requiring US sanction. A number of scholars note that the passage of IRFA, International Religious Freedom Act, by the US Congress in 1998 was the result of over 2 decades of evangelical mobilization to forge an ecumenical vision of Christianity as a universal community that needed to be saved from non-Christian persecution. As Joshua Green points out, one of the central aims of this movement has been to remoralize American foreign policy, to address religious oppression abroad, to harness the resources of the US State Department to bring about this change. The new evangelicals, as they have come to be called, are quite distinct from the earlier counterparts in that they are far more cosmopolitan, comfortable with the language of human rights that they now use ubiquitously in their various campaigns, and the freedom of religion, now the bulwark of a number of Christian organizations, is cast as a human rights issue, and websites of organizations such as Christian Solidarity International weave in and out of human rights language to make the case for a universal persecuted church. The evangelical project to promote the religious liberty of Christian minorities living in Muslim countries, with the US State Department's force behind it, has been a boon for Coptic activists, particularly the expatriate Coptic Americans who see this as an opportunity to use their political muscle as US citizens to urge their senators and congressmen to force the Egyptian government to change its policies toward Egyptian Copts. Consider, for example, Michael Munir, one of the most charismatic and youngest leaders of the Coptic diaspora, who has carved himself a place both in Washington, D.C. and the American evangelical movement. Munir, the founder of the nonprofit U.S. Copts Association, ran for election in the state of Virginia on a Republican ticket in 2005, a bid he lost. And since the ouster of Mubarak, he also ran for a presidential candidate, as a presidential candidate in Egypt, a bid he also lost. He regularly collaborates with important American Christian evangelical leaders in presenting testimonies about Coptic persecution to the Congress, serving as a bridge between lay Copts and US State Department officials. Munir's politics, like those of his fellow diasporic activists, are complicated. On the one hand, they connect the plight of Coptic Christians with the lack of democracy, corruption, and authoritarianism of the Egyptian government, making common cause with other non-Muslim religious minorities and victims of the state's brutal policies. On the other hand, they also participate in the post-9/11 Euro-American demonization of all Islamist political activists, regardless of their political leanings, often painting the reformist nonviolent Muslim Brotherhood as a jihadi organization. In a world where US national security interests seem to devolve upon protecting fellow Christians from Muslim persecution, Copts like Munir legitimate a rather simple argument popular within US foreign policy circles these days, as evident in the website of the Hudson Institute, one of the most important institutes to rally for support for the passage of IRFA in the United States. In this logic, Islamists are seen as intolerant, opposed to the values of democracy and freedom, and enemies of Christians. The US, as a Christian and democratic nation, must therefore ally itself with the persecuted Coptic Christians so as to fight fanatical Muslims. The new alliance between certain sections of Coptic Christians, the Coptic Orthodox Church, and American evangelicals represents a departure from the past, in so much as intra-denominational schisms have been set aside to forge a new unity. The historical pattern that continues to hold sway, however, is a global power's ability to shape how religious liberty can be imagined and exercised in the Middle East. Not all Coptic activists and thinkers in Egypt view IRFA as a path to their salvation from communal strife. Samir Murpuz, whose work I mentioned earlier, has made a number of trenchant arguments against IRFA and its indebtedness to the Christian evangelical movement in the United States. The title of one of his major publications states his thesis bluntly, and I quote, "Protection and Punishment, the West and the Religious Question in the Middle East, from the law of patronage to the law of religious freedom, a special case study of the Copts, history, citizenship, concerns, and the future," end of quote. That's the title of the book. I'm surprised you doesn't draw laughter. It usually draws laughter from our American audience, because it kind of makes the reading of the book moot, because you already know the thesis once you've read the title. We have a different sense of humor. Murpuz makes, perhaps it's cultural, Murpuz makes two related arguments in this book. One, that the project of IRFA clearly is predicated on violating the sovereignty of the Egyptian nation. And two, that this violation is not only the violation of its Muslim, but its Christian citizens as well. He recognizes the difference in the motivation behind IRFA and those behind older projects of Christian proselytization, but locates the continuity in the effects these projects have produced on the lives of Egyptians, Muslims, and Copts alike. Despite the historical critique Murpuz articulates, the force IRFA now commands in Egyptian public discourse is transforming how religious difference is perceived and understood among Copts. IRFA's international reach has subjected Coptic identity to a new set of demands. Key among them, the demand to translate across the register of religious difference to registers of ethnic, indigenous, and linguistic identity, all of which are far more legible markers of minority differences in the modern discourse of minority rights than religion. Consider, for example, a controversial talk delivered by a prominent Coptic bishop at the Hudson Institute that I just showed you the website for in 2008. A talk that was supposed to showcase the Coptic plight and IRFA's ability to alleviate it. In this talk, addressed to the American diplomatic and general public in Washington, D.C., Bishop Thomas cast Coptic religious difference in ethnic and linguistic terms. Claiming Copts as the indigenous inhabitants of Egypt and Arab Muslims as foreign invaders, he portrayed the conversion of Copts to Islam in 6th century not simply as a religious conversion, but also a loss of ethnic and linguistic identity. And I quote, "The Copts have been always focused on Egypt. It is our identity, it is our nation, it's our land, it's our language, it's our culture. But when some of the Egyptians converted to Islam, their focus changed away from looking to their own language and culture, and Arabia became their main focus. Are they really Copts, or have they really become Arabs? If you come to a Coptic person and tell him that he's an Arab, that's offensive. We are not Arabs, we are Egyptian," end of quote. Notably, in this logic, conversion from Christianity to Islam is not simply a change of religion, but rendered as the substitution of one ethnic identity, Coptic, with another, Arab. To give up the Coptic faith is to also lose one's indigenous identity. In this argument, and so much as Egypt is Coptic in its ethnic essence, then Arabs and Muslims are not only foreign to Egypt, but also betray the indigenous identity of the nation. Given this chain of equivalences, Bishop Thomas concludes, and I quote, "When you look at a Copt today, you don't only see a Christian. You see an Egyptian who is trying to keep his identity versus another imported identity that is working on him," end of quote. When Bishop Thomas's address reached Egypt, it created a raging debate in the media. While most Egyptian activists on behalf of Coptic rights have been accustomed to the minoritarian claim, they found the bishop's characterization of Coptic Christianity as an indigenous ethnic identity most difficult to sustain. While Bishop Thomas's argument sounded foreign to many Egyptian ears, it was quite legible to his American audiences, well schooled in minoritarian claims of ethnic and indigenous identity. It is not difficult to see how the performative demand of the political arena in which the bishop made his case, the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., required him to amplify the differences between Copts and Muslims, an amplification that seemed necessary in order to capture the attention of a powerful ally who can finally make a difference in changing the Coptic situation. The performative effect of this speech act remains to be seen. But one thing is clear, that the demand for the recognition of Coptic religious difference is subject to a set of transformative forces that are well beyond the control of the subjects who speak in its name. In conclusion, let me make 2 points. One, note that for a religious minority to call for international protection in the context of post-colonial societies is also to draw attention to the uniqueness of the group as distinct from the majoritarian identity of the nation. While this operation enhances and articulates factors within the identity of the nation, it also sets up an unstable synergy between the security afforded by the extension of foreign protection to the minority and the insecurity this protection engenders with respect to the minority's relationship to the nation. In other words, the fact that certain post-colonial religious minorities can claim international law to protect themselves from discrimination, and we must remind ourselves not all religious minorities can claim this protection also becomes a key source of their vulnerability in relationship to the nation. Their conditions of empowerment are also the conditions of their vulnerability. Second, the structural dependence of a post-colonial minority's struggle for survival on supranational forms of support requires a certain amplification of their difference to draw attention to their plight. This amplification is not simply a feature of the victim's hyperbole, but a necessary feature of making one's discrimination legible, in terms that are internal to the international discourse of minority rights and religious freedom. As I've shown, one transformation rendered in the modern meaning of minority is the shift from religious identity to an emphasis on linguistic, ethnic, cultural, and racial identity. This shift in part owes to the ascendance of the nation-state as the primary political form and the kinds of differences that are significant to its ideological and organizational structure. As Bishop Thomas's speech to the Hudson Institute makes clear, in order for the Coptic plight to register in the theater of minority rights, it must be made commensurate with other kinds of injury that are at the core of minority rights discourse in Euro-America. As a result, Bishop Thomas plays to the proclivities of his American audience and the parameters of distinction internal to the discourse of the Hudson Institute, as well as international human rights discourse on minorities. But in making religious difference commensurate with ethnic and linguistic difference, Bishop Thomas's discourse introduces two fundamental instabilities. One, the suturing of religious difference to other kinds of differences weakens the very identity on the basis of which Copts claim discrimination. Two, this amplification of differences sets Copts further apart from the Egyptian nation and its social fabric. Such a polemical accentuation of Coptic difference from Egypt's Arab and Muslim history may well gain foreign protections, but it also makes the project of finding ways of living together more difficult. The paradox that haunts the post-colonial religious minority in this moment is precisely that the terms that render religious discrimination legible are also the terms that structure religious identity to other forms of difference, and doing so, they suture religious identity to other forms of difference, and in doing so, make the minority identity unstable as much as it weakens the possibility of forging a collective life together. Thank you.
Berkeley College. I don't want to ask a question. I'd like to add an integration to the beginning of your genealogy, religious freedom, an integration that complicates it a bit. You started with Versailles and linked religious freedom to international treaties. While I think that the moment should be the Edict of Nantes in the previous century. That was promulgated by the king, Henri of Navarre. So it was effective or just in practice. And the second point, the link persecution with religious minorities. If you think to the moment in which the Anglicans came to power after the failure of the English Revolution, they were most probably an hegemonic religious minority. And if you think also more in general, I used to think that there should be a religious majority. But in Europe, in medieval Europe, probably it was not the case, because otherwise the church would have not launched in the 1st century a colonizing campaign, a religious colonizing campaign, and invented the sacraments for that. And in the 16th century, there were two joint and opposed campaigns. The Reformation campaign and the Counter-Reformation. They were colonizing European peasants from a religious point of view. And the third point, I would say that at the beginning, in the early modern Renaissance period, the problem was not religious freedom, but religious tolerance. And this means that these edicts and laws were allowing people to join a recognized church, but not, for example, allowing them not to be religious. And this went on for several centuries. But the word secularism was invented by Holyoake in the mid-19th century, when he was condemned here in England for blasphemy, and he was rightly handed over to the secular arm of the state.
Okay, any other questions?
Thanks very much, Saba, for a really wonderful lecture. And I just want to actually go to the moment where you ended. In a rather teasing way, you left ambiguous with that your phrase, these paradoxes that you illustrated, the minority question being taken up by minorities, ends up both inviting the threat against the sovereignty of the nation states, at the same time weakening the position of the minority within it. And from that paradoxical space, you said, what happens, and the two conclusions you drew, what happens is that it is not able to imagine, or it's not able to enact forms of living together, you called. And that's a very teasing conclusion, so I want to come back to you. And what kind of minority politics, given that it has been constituted as a minority, would indicate or give signs of not falling into these paradoxes, but constitute itself a politics of living together in the way in which you identified?
Should we take those two, and then I'll take a third one? It's quite a lot there.
Okay, sure.
To tackle.
Yes, absolutely. In response to the first set of comments, the history of religious freedom is very complicated in Europe, and there's a lot written on it, and some of which you are referring to. And yes, of course, my aim is not to construct a genealogy of religious liberty in Western Europe. My point was very simple, and it was a starting point, which is to say that religious liberty is often understood to be a matter of individual human right, and yet it has been tied from its very inception to national security, to state security interests, sovereignty, issues of territorial disputes, and so on and so forth. So that was my point of departure. Yes, of course, it's very complicated, and there are lots of books that have been written on it. My interest really lies in thinking about what does it mean to think of religious liberty as, from its very inception, tied to questions of sovereignty, and in the case of the non-West, the inequality of sovereignty between the West and non-West. How does it help us think through the history of the Middle East, which is certainly different than European history. Engin, your question is really a very interesting and provocative one. Let me sort of, maybe one thing I should do is to just spell out what I mean by this paradox that I'm trying to think through. I tried to think through a similar paradox when I wrote on the question of the Danish cartoons and the controversy it ignited among Muslims living in Europe. And it seemed to me that in sort of parallel ways, there was an attempt on the part of Muslims to reach to the law to try to regulate the circulation of the Danish cartoons, which were injurious. And I tried to think through of what kind of injury was it, for not just for the people who protested in the streets, but for a larger majority of Muslims who didn't necessarily take to the streets. And I increasingly, as I thought more about it and looked into it, I felt like the kind of religiosity that was at stake in finding those cartoons offensive was the kind of sensibility that could not be protected by law. If it was to be subject to claims of the law, it would have to undergo a certain kind of transformation. And in a sense then, to claim the right to, as a minority, of the protection of the law in order to be treated in ways that, for example, other sensitivities of other groups, certainly given Jewish history in Europe, have been treated, is to reach for an instrument that is well known, that is well honed within the minority politics lexicon. But it also then has a transformative effect on the kind of religiosity that it's at stake, which is not necessarily just a question of identity. It's a question of moving away from the notion of religion as a set of beliefs, symbolic representations of Muhammad, and so on and so forth. So I think that paradox is living and constant, and in a sense, what I'm trying to argue in the Coptic case as well is that there are forces on the Coptic minority to constantly try to translate their sense of injustice in language that are commensurate, making claims on the state, but also in the international community that is really structured by this inequality of Western and non-Western sovereignty. And that has, again, a transformative effect on how Copts have come to understand themselves. I think we have some ways of thinking about this in relationship to, just picking up to what Maleha was saying about the situation of Muslims in Europe, for example. The idea that has been proposed by a number of scholars now, that there has been a racialization of Muslim identity in Europe, which is both not only just an expression of, it doesn't just simply note a sociological development, it also, through that enunciation, racializes Muslims, right, and transforms a religious identity into a racial identity. There's a complicated interplay between the way that the state hails you and the way that then you claim that hailing, and then express it as a part of who you are as European subjects, Muslim subjects. And that transformative effect I find is fundamentally unstable, and is not, it is what we reach for when thinking about minority politics, to make a claim on the state. And yet its underside, its cost, to what made that injury felt in the first place, falls out of the equation often. It must be rendered commensurate with majoritarian norms in order to become legible. The question as to what kind of politics can stand out of it, what kind of minority politics can stand out of it, I don't know. I'm a pessimist in that regard. I find it to be a very difficult problem, that the politics of survival for a minority depend precisely in making its suffering commensurate with the terms that have erased it. And that erasure must be embraced and made your own, and in fact your own sense of self needs to be transformed in that language in order for it to be visible. I think that is a very difficult position for all minorities to be in.
I think there's someone there.
Thanks so much for this talk. It's really inspiring, and I don't know whether we can really ask the question, but I try. And somehow I think it's connected to what you have been talking about right now. In the very beginning, or right in the beginning of your talk, you said something like, okay, we have to acknowledge, we have to see that there are attacks, that are even organized pogroms today, but we don't necessarily need to read them as a sign of an increasing intolerance, but we can also read them as an effect of the politics of the liberal secular state. And somehow I think this also relates to what Maleha had said about the European, what is that, European Court? No.
Court of Human Rights, yeah.
Court of Human Rights, okay. So because that would be kind of like the European level of this legislation. And maybe this is more a question of clarification, whether you could say a little bit more about these state politics, also because just now you mentioned that you said, okay, certain claims can actually not really be made to the state and maybe also shouldn't be made to the state, but of course it's not only legal claims, but it's also kind of like that the state has other forms of governing and organizing the field. And so if you are kind of like referring to the caricatures, it's of course beyond this field of hate speech and symbolic violence, and we are also tackling and where the state is taking a position in that. So I don't know whether this is really more a question for clarification, maybe.
Are there any? Shall we do one more? Should we? Could you just say who you are, just briefly?
Anke Engel from the Institute for Queer Theory in Berlin.
Okay, great. I think if you take that,
Yeah.
Saba,
No, I think that's a very interesting question. One of when forms of discrimination occur, whether it is against, for example, the European Court of Human Rights decisions that upholds the ban on the wearing of the veil in a number of different contexts, whether it's France or it is Turkey. It's often understood as a violation of the secular principles that the court must uphold, right? So, for example, it's been argued in the readings of these judgments, of the European Court of Human Rights judgments, that in fact what they have done is they have let their own prejudice against Muslims really color their pure secular jurisprudence. Had they followed their better side, and had they not been blinded by the form of discrimination, that is their own discrimination against Muslims, then they would have really allowed the veil to continue to be worn in Turkey, or for the ban in France to be struck down. Now there is a way in which that argument actually posits this purest secular principle of the separation between religion and state, and what it is considered to be a religious practice, what's allowed to be a religious practice, in which the state should not intervene. It actually embraces a very delusional but a long-standing assumption, which has recently been really come to be questioned, this assumption that secularism has entailed the separation of church and state, where the state never intervenes in religion and religion is allowed its own sphere. Whereas if you look at the history of secularism, modern secularism, it is very clear that the state has constantly, modern state comes to regulate religious life in its substantive features and in its content, to the point that at times that the secular state has had to in fact act as de facto theologians in order to make certain practices indifferent to religion so that they may be brought under the jurisdiction of civil law. Now, and that has really been a sea change in the way that this literature tries to think about the cases such as the European Court of Human Rights cases. If you think about secularism outside of its own ideological self-understanding, but think of it historically, think of it sociologically as to what have states done, what have secular states done. Both the paradigmatically secular states of France and Britain, Germany and so on, and also what are considered to be, the quasi-secular states such as that of India and Egypt and so on. You begin to actually see that the modern state has not just simply retrieved from religion, it has always regulated religion. And that's partly how it's come to privatize it, to put it in its place, to actually make it irrelevant to all forms of other life, into which it was very crucial. Seen in that way, then, the fact that the European Court of Human Rights would actually regulate the wearing of the veil seems pretty consistent with the interests of the state, because in almost all of these cases, what they take up is Article 9, right? It's Article 9 is the right to religious freedom, as Malaya was talking about, and there are two clauses to that. One is the absolute freedom to believe, which the court upholds. You can believe anything you want. You can believe in squirrels as gods and it doesn't matter, no God or whatever. But the second clause says it's the right to manifest religious belief in public spaces that the state has the prerogative to be able to control and regulate. So it's the public order clause through which the state actually is able to regulate what is considered to be essentially a feature of religious life. Right now, this public order clause, the state has an interest in holding up. It has a certain interest in securing public order, which it can loosely, of course, define, what is called the margin of the state, right? It can loosely define. In this case, in Turkey, for example, the veil was understood to be a part of the national security threat that the veil was supposed to be posing at the time against the secular government that was in power at the time, right? Similarly, the French decision is crucially predicated on the public order clause. That the reason that the veil must be banned is because these Muslim minorities that are living in France are actually creating a disjuncture within the public order, the social and public order. And how does it define the public order? Interestingly enough, for the first time, the French state comes to understand itself as upholding gender equality as its secular principles, which it's never had before, but hey, it's a moving target. So what I'm trying to say is that I think rather than the usual way of understanding when the state regulates religious life, is to say, aha, it's being non-secular. But if we try to think, if we actually think about the history of secularism as the state constantly having the prerogative to regulate religious life, then you have to make this into a question not simply about the religious discrimination on the part of the judges, or, for example, the religious extremism making its way into the pure language of secular law, but you actually have to start thinking about what is the secular modern nation state's regulatory project, and how then religion and religious identity, particularly of its minorities, that always poses a problem, whether it's racialized or ethnicized or so on, becomes a problem of regulation for the state.
I think there's a microphone coming, Daria.
Hello, hi. My name is Daria Boyer. I recently finished my PhD. Anyway, my PhD was on minorities and nationalism in Turkish law. During my PhD, I looked at the Ottoman Parliamentary Court. And what I saw that all the Christian or like non-Muslim MPs, they were all against to be called as minority. It's very interesting, as you said. But then, what was happening in the Ottoman Empire? The Turkish elite, or let's say the elite, the governing elite, they had a vision. And then in this vision, they had some conditions. They wanted, state to be that way, nation to be this way, with this, qualification, whatever. But then, none of the minorities, let's say, although they didn't really consider themselves as minority, but they weren't fitting into the image of, the elite. And then at the end of the day, what happened? Ottoman Empire, in the parliament, if you look at the later dated records, and they all alienated, and then they all become more and more far from the idea of being part of Ottoman state. Ottoman state. This, at the beginning of your talk, you said, Coptic people, they were also, they refused to be called as minority. But perhaps what happened, over the time, what they wanted state to be, and how wanted society to be at the end, this wasn't really achieved, and they lost their faith in. And actually, this is so important from my point of view. Majority also should question themselves. This was a question of my thesis actually. I guess the majority, or Muslims, whatever, in Egypt today, they have to ask themselves a question rather than asking question to minorities or like these different groups, why you are feeling that way, or why you don't feel to be part of this, bigger good or whatever, the society. They should ask themselves where we are making a mistake. Then I think answer will be more fruitful. Thank you.
Should we make that There's one final question, but I think we've actually run out of time, so if you wanted to come up afterwards, that would be great. So if I could just ask Saba to make some comments in response to that, and just some closing comments, that'd be good.
Well, I wish majorities would do that, take that gesture. People in power don't tend to do that. Power has to be wrested from those in control, rather than just say, please do understand our plight. Be understanding of our pain. You have to actually do some political work to make that happen. So yes, I do think that all majorities in the world should think critically about themselves, but that fact that it doesn't end up happening requires us to think beyond just simply the actions of the groups. For me, what is really important is to think about the structural conditions of modern political forms that are really similar across Western and non-Western histories. The idea of majority and minority as a constitutional device, to actually regulate difference, assimilate difference, embrace and eradicate difference. Similarly, the form of the nation state and its own ideological structure. Similarly, the politics of rights, with all the problems that it poses in terms of that it is the state that becomes the arbiter for being able to claim any space in the collectivity of the polity. These seem to be really structurally very similar across contexts, and I completely agree with Maliha that we need to think across those similarities. And then there are local histories, right? Very particular histories that are histories of regulation of difference. And those need to be thought through those modular political forms. And I think that, in a sense, is our challenge. Throughout this morning's panel, there were suggestions about how do we think about universality and particularity as a philosophical problem. And I think this is just a manifestation of that philosophical problem. It's not about local and global. It is to think politically with difference, both conceptually, abstractly, and then in the political realm as well. And for that reason, I think the Ottoman history is actually a very interesting starting point, precisely because it is the counterpoint to how we imagine religious difference in the liberal paradigm. And that's not to say it's better. It is full of inequalities, and of course, just as the liberal system is. But for us to even understand the peculiarity of the world, the liberal world in which we inhabit, the world of difference, it sometimes really helps to look at a different place, a different time period, to think about how differently it could have been managed, and therefore produced very different kinds of inequalities than the ones we find abhorrent or ones that we embrace.
I'm sure all of you will join me in thanking Saba, and I think those final remarks really are absolutely invaluable to think through what research agendas from all our different disciplines and the way in which we could approach this similar problem that in fact you've been thinking about in this sustained way over the 2 days, about trying to combine a really rigorous attention to detail in terms of historical particularity of the cases that we're interested in, whilst at the same time taking issues about theory and structural issues really seriously. So I hope you'll join me in thanking Saba very much for an excellent way to end this particular conference. Thanks.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us for the last 2 days, and I'm still buzzing with a lot of thoughts, a lot of questions, a lot of ideas that we debated, many questions that came up, but that's what really the good things about the intense conferences such as this. Out of this intensity, sometimes the questions that trouble you for days, in some cases they trouble you for months, in some cases, they trouble you for years, and I can give an example of each of those from my own experiences. So thanks very much for your contributions. Thanks for the brilliant keynotes we heard by Walter Mignolo and Saba Mahmood. Both really took us in various different directions, but similar directions. And thank you for participating actively for our deliberations, as well as with your specific interventions and questions, and putting on the table many other issues for us to consider. And finally, I want to also thank Maliha for a really brilliant intervention I wanted to come back to, and maybe I will end on that. The notion of resisting against thinking, particularly Islam in Europe, being ontologically somehow so different that we have to get obsessed about it, by also forgetting that minoritization, the questions of minoritization and orientalization do not get exhausted by the question of Islam. And it is perhaps at this moment of intensity, it's even more significant to remember that. And hence the significance of genealogies or historically thinking about these notions of minoritization, majoritization, that Saba's work also has drawn our attention to. So on that note, thanking you again.